I'm Peter, and I want to welcome you here to the Eastside Freedom Library for what is really an extraordinarily fitting event. Hy has had an influence on our work here in so many ways. I do want to mention that Hy's books are right around the corner here, and I popped up a little display, which I think quite appropriately ranges from Hy's own PhD dissertation to several books that he wrote, and then a collection of really large dissertations that students of Hy's wrote. So if you have a chance before you leave tonight, come and take a look at this and take a look at Hy's books. We are about 5.5 years old here as the Eastside Freedom Library. Our focus is labor, immigration, and social justice history, obviously subjects that were near and dear to Hy's heart. I'm going to tell one story that I know Jay is going to elicit stories and solicit as well as elicit stories. The way we came to have Hy's books was after he passed away. His kids, Stephen and Ruth, got a hold of us because Jay had actually recommended that they talk to us about taking the books. And we had this problem that there were a lot of books, and they were not going to walk their way over here. And we were just beginning in that moment to discover that there is a program in St. Paul called Project Remand, whereby people who have run afoul of the state and are sentenced to community service rather than hard time, look for places where they can work off their community service. And two charming young men who were both undergraduate students at the U, who had been busted for transporting cannabis from the West Coast to Minnesota, got a hold of me and said, well, we have about 30 hours of community service to perform. And I said, I have just the job for you. And introduced them to Stephen and Ruth. They packed up Hy's books and schlepped them over here, and that was how the books got here. We have about 16 discrete collections of books. We wanted to shelve the books by the collections so that people could see how people had thought over a lifetime. We have Naomi Scheinman's books, Paul Rabinowitz's books, Fred Ho, who was a great jazz musician and political activist. So those are some of the collections. And many of the books are enriched by having marginal comments. Like bullshit exclamation mark. This person didn't read enough Marx or whatever. So people using those books can see who wrote the marginalia. And we've actually had one graduate student here from NYU who was writing a dissertation about Asian American performance. And she was writing a chapter about Fred. And she spent 2 weeks here taking pictures of pages in Fred's books so that secondary sources became primary sources. And just great then to see that get used in the production of new knowledge. So a little bit of housekeeping. I appreciate that you've all managed apparently to squeeze in, which is great. There are restrooms downstairs. If you prefer to use an elevator, one of the great things about this building is that we have an elevator, and so the building is completely accessible. You're welcome, obviously, to use the elevator. After the program is over, my colleague and dear friend Yuichiro Onishi, who is in the departments of African American and African Studies and Asian American Studies at the U, Yuichi is going to pass around an evaluation form. We're still experimenting with how to do evaluation, besides people either giving us money or telling us that we're really barking up the wrong tree. We had a very unpleasant run-in with some of the Republicans in the state Senate who came on a site tour and remarked publicly that we're all just a bunch of communists over here at the Senate. So, and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And the net result was, of course, that they didn't give us any money. But we do have an evaluation form. Yuichi is going to pass them around. I hope that you'll take the time to fill them out. We also have our colleagues from Subtext Books in the back. They will be selling copies of Jay's book, and I'm sure that Jay will be happy to sign them for you. So the books will be available after his presentation is over. I don't know, Clarence, am I forgetting? What am I forgetting?
I'm sure we're forgetting something.
Many things. I'm sure. This is my colleague Clarence White. Yeah, ask us and ask us questions and stuff. Hang around, and we have lots of. Actually, I hope you did sign the guest book. The guest book becomes the foundation for us to send out our email newsletter. We are now at almost 6,000 people receiving the newsletter. Thank you, Andy Dawkins. Yeah, well, you want to call attention to yourself, you can. Thank you. And so we do encourage you to sign the guest book. And there are flyers on the desk and in this tall thing that we have that spins around. There are lots of things coming up. This Friday, we are in a partnership with the Hmong Archives, and this Friday night we will have a Hmong performance artist named Tao, who will be here showing us how different Hmong musical instruments work. We have forthcoming book events, and so please do pay attention and come back. So Jay Weiner is a journalist and historian and teacher, and hopefully you saw Kurt Brown's lovely piece in the Star Tribune. So we're excited that Jay wanted to do an event here, and I look forward to both what he's going to share with us and how he's going to get us involved in recalling Hy Berman and his life and work.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks to Peter and Clarence. The University of Minnesota History Department is sponsoring this as well. And so thanks all for coming. As Peter said, there'll be Q&A afterwards, but the idea is to share Hy stories. I'm going to tell you about his life a bit and tell you some stories about him, so it should be fun. First, let me explain how the book happened. I was a reporter at the Star Tribune for 28 years, and I never quoted Hy Berman. We knew who each other was. He was on Almanac about 100 times. I was periodically on Almanac. Our paths would cross. Then about 10 years ago, Hy and a pharmacist named Tom Gupta, and Tom used to own Schneider Drug on University Avenue in Prospect Park. He had salons every once in a while, every couple of months. Political candidates would show up. It would generally be retired university professors, Prospect Park gadflies, people who looked like you, yes. And so that's how I knew Hy. Then, around that, soon afterwards, Hy and Tom and a sculptor in Minneapolis named Doug Freeman began to think of an idea of a monument, a gathering place, a hallowed spot to honor the common man, the common person. They didn't really know where it would be or what it would look like. And in the end, I don't think they really thought it would ever happen. But eventually, they began inviting people to guest dine with them. And because Tom was the pharmacist to the stars, he was my pharmacist as well, he invited me to come one night. And then over the course of a couple of years, Hy, Tom, Doug, and I would go to Cafe Diageo in St. Paul, drink martinis, and eat Italian food. And Hy would tell the same stories over and over. And the way I describe it is like a Springsteen concert. You know the songs are going to come, but you still like them. So I wondered what was going to happen to all of these. At his 90th birthday party, which he shared with David Noble, who was another great university historian, I was invited. And he was sitting in the corner of the room in the Noble house, which is just about 4 houses down from our house. And I said to him, has anybody ever gotten your stories down? And he said, nobody cares about my stories. I said, well, somebody should do that. He said, okay, you can come over to the house. So that was February of 2015. And around April or so, I finally got over there. And 2 people who helped me to do that were President Kaler, who's here, and Amy Phoenix, who was his chief of staff. So they gave me permission, allowed me to play hooky on a number of Friday afternoons, and I'd go over to Hy's house and we did some interviews. In those interviews, he told me he didn't really keep much, even though it was a historian. But the first day that we sat there, he said to me, what do you think? And he showed me a 3-ring binder, a blue 3-ring binder, hours of interviews that he had done with some other political scientists from Long Beach State that were pretty high-level politics stuff, a lot about communism. And so, in fact, he had told his stories to someone else. And he looked me in the eye, he said, what do you think? And I got hypnotized, and I agreed to help him on the book. I wasn't really sure what I had gotten myself into. Again, he told me he didn't have much that he had kept. I went to the University Archives. There were a bunch of 3x5 cards about old strikes and other things, and a bunch of folders, many of which, pardon the expression, said, God damn it, Berman, where's that article you're supposed to have for us last year or 2 years ago? There are a lot of folders like that. And he and I sat on those interviews. We watched all Almanac shows. He agreed we could use that stuff. We filed for his Freedom of Information Act request. I learned some stuff about him. I tried to connect the dots between the interviews he had done with Jack Stewart, the man from Long Beach State. And then in November, actually this week, 4 years ago, he died. And we had done the outline for the book, and we had done 1 chapter. So there I was in the middle of this thing, and the night of his funeral, Betty, his wife, came up to me, and she wagged her finger at me and said, you're going to finish that book, aren't you? Which put me in a bad spot. Ultimately, he moved out of the house, and yes, these books were all of his, but there were, he had lied, 22 boxes of Hy's stuff, of his transcripts, of his grades from 6th grade, of notes he had sent to his mother and she had sent to him, and some other interviews he had done. So I pieced those together with the interviews we had done, with the Almanac shows, with some writings that were in his voice, and that's what this book is. It's not a biography per se. It's not an autobiography, really. It is what it says it is, a last lecture from Hy, and the joke is that I want you to hold the book up to your ear and hear Hy, and so that's the goal here. So let me show you though how I got to know Hy, and the sound here is not on this video. It isn't very good, so I'm going to have to play it off of my phone. It's not the fault of the sound system here. So this is Hy in 2014 when he's 89 years old. And I think the themes that he raises here are themes that were important to him. They were about personal change, about immigration, about his commitment to the working class, and all the while being somewhat of a scholar even at this. And this is Tom's pharmacy, the salon that I talked about here. So let's see if, I hope that you can hear this.
Strongly that ordinary folks can make a difference. I've seen that in my historical research. immigrants came to the United States impoverished. They were working class people, and of course fought on the left-wing side of the society, and always felt themselves not quite a part of our society, but wanting to fit in commemorating ordinary folks who've done extraordinary things in opposing tyranny, oppression, or standing for justice or for right, that these folks should be commemorated, honored, and of course, we should, from their experience, learn perhaps how we can ourselves have an impact.
So that was Hy at 89, and pretty much what he sounded like when I did the interviews for him soon after. Let me show you a little bit more about his life. That's Hy on your left at 5 years old. That's his mother and his grandmother, his brother Harold, who is still alive. Hy spoke Yiddish until he was 5 years old. His mother, Yetta, was considered to be more radical than his father, David, who was kicked out of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers for being too radical. So that's what his mom would be like. Hy claims his first word was Bolshevik when he was 2 years old. I find that hard to believe. So this is from about 1930. This is now Hy as a camp counselor at age 17. This is Camp Kinderland. Camp Kinderland was a camp for the children of left-wing Jewish people from New York. And this is the camp that Hy went to as a little boy, then became a counselor, then a teacher. And it's the camp that eventually got him into trouble with the House Un-American Activities Committee. The only time he was mentioned in JUAC was when one witness mentioned him as being a counselor at Camp Kinderland. But throughout his life, even though Hy claimed he was not a member of the Communist Party, every organization that he was affiliated with until he was in his mid-30s was communist linked. And you'll see something later that I want to show you that will reveal exactly how much in the end he thought was a mistake. So he eventually goes into the army and never goes overseas. He doesn't go overseas because he thankfully gets a hernia. And at the time that his troop is supposed to head out, he can't go. And I read this in other events, but I'm not going to do it tonight because I want to get this over for your stories. But his entire unit is wiped out in Europe. So Hy is saved by having a double hernia, which he laughed about and cried about. But one of the things he did when he was out of the Army and back in New York, as part of the GI Bill, there was a program called 52 for 52, which was you got $52 a week for 52 weeks to decompress from the Army. And one of the things he did, let me get my phone again because I don't think the sound works on this video, this PowerPoint, is he did radio commercials in Yiddish for the Yiddish station. And you don't really need to understand Yiddish to enjoy this because it's pretty high-like. Let me do this here. And believe me, you don't need to understand Yiddish.
Take a glass hear the way it bubbles and fizzes. That's how it's going to bubble and fizz in your stomach. In a while, there'll be no more headaches, no more stomach aches, no more problems of general depression and feeling of illness. Why,
So you can tell me that Alka-Seltzer was an amazing drug. But that's how he passed his time until he went to graduate school and came to meet this man named Hy Berman. The important thing about him, besides the fact he was the greatest Jewish historian of his time, of any time, this is a guy who wrote 19 volumes of the history of the Jewish people and only got up to the year 1650. So he was a details guy, I think. But what he was really great at, according to Hy, was coming into a lecture hall, giving a lecture without any notes. And when Hy saw him the first time, he said, "I want to be like that guy." And eventually he and Berman became friends. He became his mentor. Betty, Hy's wife, worked for Berman. It really made Hy into the scholar that he was. So then Hy becomes a pretty serious grad student at Columbia, and he's teaching at City College, and we think that's him as a research assistant. And in the book, a little bit, I guess I don't make light of it, but I talk more about his stories in his life. But Hy was a scholar of the highest order. He was a translator for all of us. He was a fighter against anti-Semitism and wrote about anti-Semitism here in the state. He embraced multiculturalism. He was involved in the development of departments of African American studies, women's studies, Latino studies, or those departments that have become those at the U. He was a labor historian, of the highest order, and an advocate for working people. You saw him talk about immigrants, and of course he became a Minnesota historian. On the part about being a scholar, for those of us who were history majors for a little bit in college, among his mentors were Alan Nevins, John Hope Franklin, and Richard Hofstadter, who are three of the, when I was in school, three of the biggies of that period. On the issue of anti-Semitism, this is probably, to me, one of Hy's most important scholarly works, and it's about the 1938 gubernatorial election here in Minnesota, which was tainted by a Republican anti-Semitic smear campaign against Elmer Benson, who was the protege of Floyd Olson. The important thing about this, besides this article, there are two important things. One is, this article is one that was under attack by some people at the university recently in the renaming of the buildings because of some things that Hy talks about relative to the U. As we made the book shorter, and I determined that some of the university stuff was a little bit in the weeds, we took some of that out, and I don't mind doing that, but I think that it's hard to dispute the fact with all the footnotes and all the scholarship we did there, that this article does not stand up to scrutiny. The other important part of this is that Harold Stassen wound up winning that race in 1938. And when Hy's article came out in 1976, Stassen called him and was unhappy with the way that Hy linked him to the anti-Semitic campaign. Because Stassen had put an ad in the Jewish newspaper, the American Jewish World, the day before the election, a couple of days before the election, trying to distance himself from the anti-Semitic stuff. Hy said that was bullshit, you didn't do enough. They became friends, and when Harold Stassen died, he asked Hy to speak at his funeral. So even though Hy was a left-winger to the highest order, he could cross the aisle. Some quick friendships. Hy and Rudy. Hy and Rudy Perpich had a special friendship. A lot of it goes back to the immigration issue. Hy's parents were immigrants, Rudy's parents were immigrants. Hy's father was a communist, Rudy's father was a communist. And they met when Hy really became a Minnesota historian in 1961-63. He had just moved here to the university, and his first assignment was to go up to the Iron Range and write about Finnish immigrants on the range. Purbich is not Finnish, but he was on the range. Hy met him and his family when Rudy Purbich was a dentist and on the school board in Hibbing. They remained friends when Purbich became a senator, state senator. Hy stayed in touch with him. And then at that moment when Wendell Anderson decided to name himself to the US Senate when Hubert Humphrey died, something that Hy thought was ridiculous and stupid and would ruin and destroy Wendell Anderson's career, which it did, Rudy became the governor. And Hy became part of his kitchen cabinet and a speechwriter for certain things. He wrote the inaugural speech for Purbich. He also wrote a speech about the importance of history, which we made the final chapter in the book. It's really Hy's view of what history is and the mind meld between him and Purbich. But they had a falling out. When Purbich lost an election and came back from Europe, he decided to run again, but on an anti-choice, anti-abortion stance. Hy didn't agree with that. Purbich wanted Hy to come back and work for him. Hy said no, and their friendship ended in a certain amount of bitterness, really. Then there was Hubert Humphrey. So in 1968, well, the first story is one that Kurt Brown told yesterday in his story, that when Hy was becoming a teacher in New York, they said that he wouldn't get a job because his New York accent was too thick. So they gave him a record of someone who sounded just like an American, and it was Humphrey's 1948 speech to the Democratic Convention. Little did Hy know that 40 years later they would share an office at the university. In the 1960s, 1967, 68, Hy was a big supporter of Gene McCarthy for president, and really an opponent of Humphrey, and thought that Humphrey's stance on Vietnam was wrong and evil. Arthur Naftalin, who was then the mayor of, who was then a university professor, would go on to be the mayor of Minneapolis, was trying to convince Hy at that point to support Humphrey. Hy didn't want to do that. But after Bobby Kennedy was killed, and as things changed, Hy came around and did support Humphrey. Humphrey then lost. And after losing, he came back to Minnesota and had a joint appointment at Macalester College and at the university as a teacher. The university's political science department, however, didn't want Hubert to be part of the department because he didn't have a PhD. And Hy thought that was pretty stupid. And this is a guy who had, depending on who you talk to, maybe had won the election, but he couldn't be a political science teacher at the U. So it was President Malcolm Moose, I'm pretty sure at the time, asked Hy if he would share an office with Humphrey because the history department would accept him. And they became friends and colleagues. And Humphrey eventually got back into politics and missed a number of classes, but he always had someone to stand in for him. When Humphrey was dying in 1978, Hy just couldn't get it up for him to go out to see Humphrey on his deathbed. Humphrey did call him, but it was a friendship that was sweet and did last until the end. In 1952, Hy wrote this pretty esoteric article in a journal called Historia Judaica, which actually was pretty hard to find. He had told me about this before he died. And in this article, you have to read between the lines, but it's a book review about anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. And Hy, in the review, supports the author. Hy's friends in the Communist Party, and those linked to the Communist Party, thought that this was a denunciation of communism. And he was shunned by his friends for having written this article. What would happen, though, later is this. 50 years later was the anniversary of the assassination of a bunch of Jewish communist poets and artists in the Soviet Union. And Hy gave a speech to a group called the Yiddish Winkel, which is a group that I talked to a couple weeks back. And you need to watch this, and the sound is good on this. So he's 77 years old. And to me, it's how uneasy he looks saying these words that he will say.
Let me end this discussion by saying that I was one of those who believed firmly in the future of socialism as practiced in the Soviet Union. I was one of those who strongly believed that the Soviet Union was in fact allowing for a wide dissemination and discussion of Yiddish cultural activities. I was wrong, terribly wrong. As a matter of fact, so wrong that I now regret my early upbringing, my parents' devotion, and my faith in that system. By the way, my faith in that system ended in 1952, at the same time that these people were shot, but for different reasons. In 1952, the Shvansky trial in Czechoslovakia opened up my eyes. When Lozovsky asked the question of the rest of the defendants, how could we support a system like this? And I, one of the leading supporters of this system, how could you have done it? He answered the first time he spoke Yiddish, since 1907. Wir sind alle Hasidim, Hasidim von dem Ruf Stalin. For those of you who don't understand, he said, we are all Hasidim of the Rabbi Stalin. Therefore, we can see no wrong. There are many other aspects of this sad tale that I could go into, but I think I've given you enough to really increase your sense of sorrow on this day. Thank you very much.
So now that you're all depressed, we can talk about Hy as the cuddly uncle scholar figure on Almanac. He appeared between 90 and 100 times. It's unclear how much. And this is really, besides some other work he did for Channel 2, where he made his name as a real translator of state, of what's happened in the state over the last 100 years or so. Some of this popular nature of Hy's work drew a little bit of tension among the faculty at the U, and I'm learning people here now who can explain that. But he was viewed as not scholarly enough for being so accessible. He didn't really care. He said something like, you know, I would rather talk to thousands of people on TV than write in a journal for 60 people. And in the end, while Hy did write a couple of books and some articles, he didn't produce a ton of stuff that's written, but he produced a lot of stuff in terms of op-eds, TV shows, etc. And it's something that he began back in the 1960s in New York on the educational radio stations there. And John Hope Franklin, the great historian, who was one of his mentors, heard him and said, "Hy, you know, you're pretty good at this." And that continued on until he actually moved here in 61 and 62 and did shows, did classes on the old Channel 2 that before the internet, before interactivity, and if he would get a letter or two every week, he thought that he had really scored big. Before I close, let me just tell you how he came here to the state, because I forgot or I didn't tell you. So Hy had trouble getting a job in academia in the late 1950s, then taught in New York, got some little jobs, finally got a job at Michigan State in 1960, which was a good job. It wasn't in the Department of History, but it was in a more of a general studies department. But his friend, David Noble, who I mentioned, they'd become friends through a historical society or American History Society conventions, asked him if he would come here to the university for a lecture about the 1877 railroad strike. And Hy did, and thought it went well. One of the things about East Lansing that he didn't like and his wife Betty didn't like was that there were no sidewalks where they lived. It was near the football stadium, and they had just come from New York. They missed New York. They were opera buffs. They liked the arts, and they basically thought that Michigan State was kind of a Yahoo school. But he came here, unbeknownst to him, it was a recruiting deal. He gave the speech. We talked about the 1877 strike. That night he was invited to the dean's house or something like that. It's in the book. And the next day he gets an offer. And he says to the folks there, I've only been at Michigan State for about 3 or 4 months, but I better call my wife. So he called Betty, and he told her about the job offer, and she said, do they have sidewalks in there? And we did, so here it is. Finally, this to me is Hy in his prime, and I can only imagine what he would have been like as a professor. This is 1992. It's an interview on the old TPT in a show called Portrait. And it's really a man in full right here. He's not the cuddly guy in the sweater in Almanac. He's not the nervous 77-year-old talking about his views of communism. He's not the 89-year-old who looked a little frail there in Tom's pharmacy. It's certainly somebody I didn't know, but this is Hy Berman.
I don't think that there are a set of key insights that I would want my students to have. What I would like them to have is perhaps an approach. If you want to be fancy about it, a methodology. What I'd like them to have is the ability to see the present in terms of the development of their own societies in the past. To be able to have some kind of an understanding that the world didn't begin with their birth, that the problems that they face and the society in which they live have been, the problems have been cumulative, the society has been cumulative. And what I'd like for them to come away with is an idea that there is, in fact, a necessity to look into the experience of the past in order to understand their own contemporary world and their own situation in that contemporary world. That's what I'd like them to come away with.
What about an orientation to the past? I mean, don't you want to help give them a sense of how to look at it, or perspective?
Not necessarily. In other words, I'm not going into the classroom with a view that I know exactly what happened. I don't. Nor do I want to go into the classroom with the certitude of a definitive theoretical construct about where we are and how we got here. What I'd like them to come away with is the ability to think critically by using historical materials in order to understand their present condition. Now, certainly I have a point of view. And it's not hidden from the students, but it's not presented as the truth with a capital T and a capital T, but it's presented as an approach that may be right, probably is right because I'm saying it, but it could also be wrong.
Have you been satisfied with your life as a university professor?
Well, it's been fun. I mean, where else can you constantly be involved in meeting students fresh and new and always having an opportunity to interact with them? Where else can you have a chance to raise questions regarding your own specialty and have it challenged by graduate students and have the exchanges that lead us, we hope, to some form of deeper knowledge or deeper understanding.
Well, Hy Berman, I want to thank you very, very much for being with us here tonight on Portrait.
It's been my pleasure.
So, Hy taught us that history matters, that we should view history through the eyes of the vanquished and not just the winners. that was important for us to understand the struggles of the common person. He died on November 29, 2015, so just in about four days from now, he was 90. And my goal and the goal here tonight, I think, is for us to keep his voice and his spirit alive. So, thanks. Peter tells me there are people here who have their own Hy stories, and that'd be great. I can answer questions, whatever you want. Peter, you've got one about P9, I know, in Hy. Did you guys have a falling out over the P9 strike? Not to confront you, but...
Yeah, I mean, it's not a permanent
falling
out, but a disagreement. Hy, whatever his falling out with Rudy Perpich might have been, Hy supported Rudy at that time. And Rudy sent the National Guard to break the strike in January of 1986. Thank you, Clarence. The National Guard was used to break the strike. And there were a lot of people who questioned what kind of Democrat was Rudy Perpich to use the National Guard. Many of us were citing Orville Freeman's action in 1959 to use the National Guard to support the strike at the Wilson plant in Albert Lea. So I remember that at the same time in early 1986, another University of Minnesota historian, Rudy Vicoli, who I had to talk Rudy out of getting arrested. Rudy was really eager to go to Austin and confront the National Guard and get arrested. So there I was in between Rudy and Hy. There was lots of room for differences of opinion. Jay, do you have something in particular there?
I'm just looking back at, at the book, because Rudy, Hy did support Rudy, but he did not like the fact that he called the Guard out. And he wrote an op-ed in the Star Tribune, he called Anton, and Anton, that's Rudy's father, called Rudy and said, "Rudy, you're a strikebreaker." And apparently, Rudy explained carefully and quietly what he had done with the National Guard and why. His father was quiet through the whole thing. After Rudy stopped, his father said, "Yeah, Rudy, you're my son, I love you dearly, but you're a strikebreaker," and he hung up.
Thank you. I know, Gene, did you want to tell a story about Camp Kinderland?
What I wanted to say was, those of us who were products of Camp Kinderland, who grew up, in my case, in the 50s and late 40s and 50s, the impact of that milieu, the impact of that camp, and what it meant for us as children of leftists in New York, the Jewish communist left. Camp Kinderland was the one place that was someplace we could go and be ourselves and not have to hide who our parents were, what their politics were. Because when you were going to school there, I said, "What does your father do?" And you just didn't tell your friends. Well, my father was an organizer for the Communist Party. It didn't seem real well. But you could go to Kinderland, and that's where we could be ourselves and do our thing. And Hy was a product of that, and the impact that had on us was really tremendous. And so I just want to underscore how much that must have been an influence in Hy's life, as it was for all of us.
What to add? Gene was my counselor at Camp Kinderland when I was a kid. In the time in the 50s, as he described it, I remember us playing baseball out on the field, and cars would stop, and there would be guys with cameras taking pictures of all of us. You know who they were. I never got my file, but I probably could find some kid pictures in it. I will tell one Hy story. I was a graduate student in sociology, I needed 2 languages in addition to English. Right?
Closer.
I passed my Spanish exam the first week I arrived, but I had to face the prospect of learning another language. Well, I had studied Yiddish from the time I was a kid. Studied Yiddish in classes. My parents spoke it at home, and in spite of myself, I learned it. I tried not to, but I learned it. So I went to the graduate school and said, can I use Yiddish as a second language? And they said, yes, one other person had done it. And we have 2 people who could test you, Hy Berman being one of them. So I went to Hy, he agreed to test me, and he found a journal. I had no idea it was a journal of Jewish sociology. And he found an article on Jewish sociologists in the 1930s in Poland, written in Yiddish. And he hands it to me, and he says, go in the room and translate it. No dictionary. 2 hours later, I come out soaking wet, sweating through it, words that I'd never seen before, but I translated in context. And Hy looks through it, he says, very good, and he passes me. So years later, we talked about it, and we started comparing our history background. And my grandfather was a writer for one of the Yiddish papers. And he said, he was your grandfather? I said, yeah. Why didn't you tell me I would have passed you?
Oh, do you want to?
Yeah, you've written a couple of books, and I can't recall any crowd like this showing up for the first book.
Well, that's because the second book I wrote was called "This Is Not Florida."
But my question is not about that.
But
what does the public response that you have been seeing in response to your book tell you about Hy Berman? What do you take from the public's response to you having written this book?
I can tell you were a Supreme Court justice with that question. This is Paul Anderson. Another book I wrote called "This Is Not Florida" is something that he had said to one of the lawyers in this Frank and Coleman recount. Well, I can only speak about the 3 events that I've had, and it says that there was, affection for Hy, that people knew who he was. There aren't too many professor types who are known as a public figure. Very few get the sort of obituaries that Hy got in the paper. So I think the jury, so to speak, is still out on that, but he certainly had thousands of students, and I hope that it shows that people care about the state's, the history of the state, and then the importance of knowing about that. And if you read the final chapter of the book, that is the speech that Hy wrote for Purpose, you'll see why I think he's so important, and the quote that he says, a community that doesn't know its history is like a person with amnesia. So that's the best I can do in answering that.
Over here. Go ahead.
My story is a family story because Hy and Betty were my neighbors growing up, and I was good friends with their children. But before I was born, they bought their house in 1961, and Art Appleton was running for mayor. And my parents hadn't met the new people down the block yet. And somebody came, and my parents were very active in the DFL, and they had an Art Appleton sign in the lawn, and somebody came and defaced it with anti-Jewish signs. Hy and Betty walked down the block, came to the door, introduced themselves, and apologized because they felt it was for them. And they're talking to my parents, and my parents said, well, they'd come from California. They were really appalled that it happened, very apologetic. They became really, really good friends. So, and the other thing is, I went to Seward School with their daughter Shelley, and one of the things she complained about was how Christian public school was at that time. So one of the things he did was he brought in the menorah and explained Hanukkah to my class and her class and some other classes about 2 weeks after she left us. So he was my first person I was super proud of. He kept a promise like that. He did a lot for the people I grew up with. published in 1966. I look at his stuff he wrote, and I'm like, oh, well, you've got us young.
Hy's daughter Shelley, so one of the ground rules when we started our interviews was that the family, he didn't want the book to be about his family. But at some point it came up about Shelley, his third daughter, who died. She was 7 when she died of an aneurysm. And he said it was the worst event of his life. He took about a year off. And he also didn't volunteer that Betty, his wife, was a Holocaust survivor, which was a little bit shocking that he didn't volunteer that. But Betty and Hy came to our house, and my spouse, Anne Jurgens, is here, and we were in the middle of a conversation about Israel. And Betty said something like, I don't like to talk about Israel ever since I got out of Auschwitz. And if that isn't a jaw-dropper in the middle of a dinner conversation, I don't know what is. Eventually, he did talk a little bit about it. There's a book written about these young women, Holocaust survivors, who all moved to New York, and it's from that book that I was able to recreate the story of her as well.
This probably doesn't say much about Hy, but I think it's kind of an amusing anecdote. During the many years we were both at the university, we got so we at least recognized each other. I'm not even sure you ever knew my name, but the last time I saw him was during intermission at the Guthrie. And I think he had been in a conversation with someone else and was slightly distracted. So I greeted him, and he greeted me kind of absently, and then looked up and realized that he recognized me and greeted me a little bit more warmly. The interesting thing about the conversation is only 4 words long, and all 4 words were the same one. It went like this: Hi, Hy. Hi.
Oh, great. You have something?
Hi. Hi. My name is Al. It's not Hy. No, Hy was I was an undergrad in his classes. He was a mentor to me. Did graduate work with him and later work. Became dear friends the last few years of his life. One period that we didn't touch on too much was World War II. Hy was in intelligence, and he interviewed German officers to get their information. And the conversation came up, we were talking about waterboarding, and remember Vice President Cheney and that whole controversy. So I said, Hy, what did you do? He said, we outsmarted them. We didn't have to torture them. So what did you do? I said, well, we played good guy, bad guy. One American officer would interview the German officers, colonels and above, and if the guy resisted, he'd call me up. And we had weapons, but we weren't loaded. The German officers didn't know that. And the other guy would say, Heidi, come here. And Hy would, he wasn't very tall. He'd throw his gun on the table, and he'd look at this German officer and he'd say, I'm a Jew, and I'm here for revenge. So they talked every time.
Well, it's 8 o'clock, and so I think are we good, Peter?
Sure, if you want to sign some books.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And you've got evaluation forms to hand around.
Yeah, if you can. You can fill out these evaluation forms, and when you're done, you could just place it on the front desk here.
Sure.
Yeah, well, thank you all for coming. Yeah, appreciate it.
And look around, look at Hy's books, talk to each other. Great. Jay, another round for Jay, please.